She heard the words through the dry summer air like a knife finding its way between her ribs, and she could not breathe. Delia Pritchard stood at the fence line on the eastern edge of the Carver property, her fingers wrapped so tight around the weathered wooden post that splinters bit into her palm, and she stared at Elijah Carver, as if he had just confessed to something that changed every single calculation she had been making since the moment she arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, 6 weeks ago. He had not looked at her directly when he said it. That was the thing. He had been staring out across the field, that wide, flat expanse of dark earth stretching toward the orange horizon, and his jaw had been working like a man trying to grind down a stone, and then he had said it plain and quiet and devastating. "I have planted this field 20 years and never cared like now." The words hung between them in the August heat. A crow called somewhere behind the cottonwood stand. The creek whispered its low, constant indifference. Delia let go of the fence post. She looked at him, at the deep lines around his eyes, at the dust that lived permanently in the creases of his neck, at the broad hands that had worked this land since before she had ever learned to want anything. And she felt the trap she had not seen coming close its teeth around her completely, because she knew what he meant. And knowing what he meant was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she stepped off the stagecoach in a cloud of red dust and desperation, carrying a carpet bag full of secrets, and a past she had not told a single soul in this town. She had come here under false pretenses. That was the plain truth of it. And now the most honest man she had ever met in her life was standing at a fence on a Tuesday evening, telling her in his oblique, careful way that he had fallen in love with her. And she had no earthly idea what to do with that. The air between them felt like the moment before a thunderstorm when every particle of the world holds still. Elijah finally turned and looked at her. His eyes were the color of the creek at its deepest point, that blue-gray green that had no name, and they were searching her face with the same patient, relentless attention he gave to weather patterns and soil conditions, as if she were something he could read if he only studied long enough. "Delia," he said. And she ran, not literally. She was not a woman who ran, but she turned on her heel and walked back toward the house with the kind of deliberate speed that told every observing eye that something had broken open, and that she needed the 4 walls of her room before it finished breaking. She needed to think. She needed to remember who she was and why she had come here and what was at stake. She needed to remember that the dark past she was carrying was not some abstract weight. It had a name, a face, and a pair of cold eyes that were very likely pointed in the direction of Redemption Creek right now. And she needed to remember that loving Elijah Carver back, which she had been doing quietly and desperately for at least 4 of those 6 weeks, was a luxury that a woman in her position could not afford. 6 weeks earlier, Delia Pritchard had arrived in Redemption Creek with exactly $11 in paper money, a letter she had stolen from a dead woman's handbag, and no plan beyond surviving the next 48 hours. Her name was actually her own, which was more than she could say for some things about herself at that moment. She was 27 years old, born in Missouri to a schoolteacher mother and a father who had died of fever when she was 9, and she had spent the last 3 years in Kansas City making her way as a bookkeeper for a mercantile firm owned by a man named Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt was the reason she was running. He was not a man given to loud violence. He was the other kind, the kind who smiled and maneuvered and twisted the law to his own purposes, who had connections to judges and marshals and territory officials, who could arrange for a woman to be charged with embezzlement when he was the one who had been cooking his own books for a decade, and who had looked at Delia across his office desk 3 months ago and told her very quietly that she had 2 choices. She could take the blame for financial irregularities she had not committed, sign a confession he had already written, and spend the next several years in prison while he continued to operate his business unimpeded. Or she could marry his son, a soft-handed young man of 20 who drank too much and had never shown any personal interest in Delia beyond what his father directed him toward. She had chosen neither. She had chosen the dead woman's letter. The woman had been a stranger on a train, an older woman named Clara Whitfield, who had suffered a seizure in the seat beside Delia somewhere between Kansas City and Wichita, and who had died quietly and without drama while Delia held her hand and called for the conductor. In the confusion that followed, while Delia was helping to sort through the woman's bag for identification, she had read the letter. It was an advertisement response. Clara Whitfield had answered a notice in a territorial newspaper, a notice placed by one Elijah Carver of Redemption Creek, Texas, seeking a housekeeper and cook of good character to manage the domestic affairs of a working cattle ranch. The pay was room, board, and a small monthly wage. The position was legitimate. Clara had written a warm, competent letter describing her qualifications, and Elijah Carver had written back accepting her and giving her the date of arrival. The date of arrival was 9 days away. Delia had stared at that letter for a long time while the train conductor dealt with Clara Whitfield's body, and then she had made a decision that was not strictly moral but was entirely necessary. She did not pretend to be Clara Whitfield. That would have been too fragile a deception, too easily exposed. What she did was simpler and slightly less dishonest. She sent a telegram to Redemption Creek from the Wichita station, explaining that Clara Whitfield had been taken ill and would be unable to take the position, and that she, Delia Pritchard, was a friend of Clara's and a woman of similar qualifications who was prepared to fill the role if Mr. Carver would consider her. She listed her skills honestly. She could cook, she could keep accounts, she had managed a household before, she was not afraid of hard work. She did not mention Gerald Holt. She did not mention Kansas City. She did not mention that she was, at that precise moment, the subject of a warrant that Holt had almost certainly already set in motion. The telegram that came back 2 days later was brief. Elijah Carver was a man who did not waste words even in writing. Position available. Come when ready, E. Carver. She had arrived on a Thursday in mid-July, 1883, stepping off the stagecoach at the Redemption Creek Depot with the sun already murderous at 9 in the morning. And the first thing she had seen was a man leaning against a post outside the livery stable across the road, arms folded, watching the stage with the particular quality of attention that told you he was always watching without making a performance of it. He was tall, rangy, perhaps 35 or 36, though the sun and the work made the arithmetic of his age difficult to read. He had dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples, and a jaw that had clearly never concerned itself with impressing anyone. He was wearing a plain cotton-work shirt, dusty boots, and a hat that had been reshaped by weather into something entirely its own. He pushed off the post when she stepped down, walked across the road without hurrying, and stopped 2 feet from her with his hat in his hands, not as a performance of courtesy, but as the automatic habit of a man raised to it. "Miss Pritchard," he said. "Mr. Carver," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not rudely, but with that same measuring quality she would come to know well. Then he picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it and said, "Wagon's down the way. It's about 6 miles to the ranch. Hot ride." "I'll manage," she said. And that was, in its entirety, the beginning of Delia Pritchard and Elijah Carver. The Carver Ranch was a serious operation. She understood this within the first 20 minutes of arriving, as she surveyed the layout from the wagon bench beside Elijah, who drove with the loose-wristed ease of a man who had been handling reins since childhood. There were 300 head of cattle on the property, a full complement of outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the 4 permanent hands, and a main house that was built solidly and without any vanity, but had been allowed to fall into the kind of domestic disorder that settles over any household managed entirely by men for too long. "Your predecessor," Elijah said, meaning the woman who had managed the house before Clara Whitfield had even become relevant to the conversation, "left 2 years ago. My sister helped when she could, but she is 3 hours north and has her own family." "I understand," Delia said. "I am not a difficult man to work for," he said. "I have few requirements, meals at regular times, accounts kept straight, laundry managed. I do not need conversation or entertainment." She had almost smiled at that. "Almost. Good," she said. "Neither do I." He had glanced at her sideways at that, and something in his expression had shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when a hand touches it from the other side, not opened, just registered. The first 2 weeks were purely functional. Delia threw herself into the work with the focused energy of a woman who needed not to think. The house came back to life under her hands. She scrubbed floors, aired linens, organized the kitchen, took stock of the larder and wrote a supply list, learned the schedule of the ranch and built her cooking around it. She fed 4 ranch hands and 1 taciturn cattle rancher 3 times a day and discovered that she was, in fact, a better cook than she had represented herself to be, which was gratifying in a small way. Elijah appeared at meals. He said thank you. He occasionally noted, with no apparent emotional investment, that a particular dish was good. He worked from before sunrise to after dark and came in at the end of each day carrying the smell of cattle and dust and sun, and he was always quietly polite in a way that cost him nothing because it was simply who he was. She watched him the way you watch something unfamiliar that you are not yet sure whether to trust. She noticed things. That he always checked on the horses himself at night before he slept, even when the hands had already done it. That he kept a small, worn Bible on the mantelpiece, but she never saw him read it. It was just there, the way a photograph of someone beloved is just there. That he did not drink beyond a single glass of whiskey on Saturday evenings, measured out with the deliberateness of a man who had made himself a rule about it. That when one of the hands, a young man named Pete Granger, came in from the south pasture with a badly gashed hand from a wire fence, Elijah had sat with him for an hour while the local doctor's assistant rode out, not saying much, just present, because that was apparently what Elijah Carver did when someone in his care was hurting. It was that last thing that had started the trouble. That was when Delia had begun to feel something she had not given herself permission to feel. She was in the kitchen doorway when she saw it, Elijah sitting at the table across from young Pete, the boy's bandaged hand between them, Elijah talking low and steady in a voice she couldn't quite hear. The evening light came through the west window in a long copper bar and lay across them both, and Elijah's face in that light was so unexpectedly kind that Delia had felt something shift in her chest like tectonic plates. She had gone back into the kitchen and stirred a pot that didn't need stirring for about 5 minutes. By the end of the 3rd week, she had a problem. The problem had a name, and it was Gerald Holt, because Redemption Creek had a general store that also served as a post office. And when Delia walked in one Wednesday morning for supplies, the postmaster, a talkative man named Dorsey, mentioned with cheerful curiosity that there had been inquiries coming through the territorial wire about a woman matching her general description. Someone in Kansas City looking for a person of interest. Delia had kept her face entirely still, while her heart attempted to exit her body through her ribs. She had bought her flour and her salt and her baking powder and walked back to the wagon and sat in the seat for 3 full minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Holt had found her direction, if not her precise location yet. The question was how long before the former became the latter. She had 2 options. She could run again, get back on a stage and go further south, deeper into Texas, into territory where the telegraph lines were fewer and the reach of a Kansas City businessman was thinner. Or she could stay and figure out a way to make herself unfindable, which in 1883 was a more achievable goal than it might sound because the infrastructure of law and communication was still thin enough in many places to lose yourself in. She had stayed, and she had told herself it was purely strategic. Redemption Creek was off the main routes. The hands knew her as Carver's housekeeper and had no reason to connect her to anything in Kansas City. If she kept her head down and her profile low and waited for Gerald Holt's interest to be drawn elsewhere by the natural pressure of his many other schemes. She could survive this. She had stayed. And she had not told Elijah Carver a single word of it. That was the betrayal she lived with. Not large and dramatic, but constant, like a stone in a boot. By the fourth week she had begun talking to him in the evenings. This was not something either of them had planned or particularly decided. It simply happened the way a creek finds a low path, gradually and then entirely. He would come in from the last check of the day, and she would have coffee on the stove, and sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table while she finished cleaning up, and they would talk about the ranch, about the cattle, about the weather, which in Texas in late July and August was always of serious practical concern. He talked about the land with a depth of knowledge and attention that she found unexpectedly beautiful. He knew every acre of the property with an intimacy that was more like love than like ownership. "This field here," he had said one evening, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table between them and pointing to the large eastern section. "My father planted this in sorghum the year I was born. I have never planted anything but cattle grass and winter wheat in it since I took over, but the soil is something particular. You can feel it when you work it, like it remembers." "Remembers what?" she had asked. He had looked up at her with an expression that was difficult to translate. "What it's capable of," he said. She had looked down at the map and not said anything, and the silence had been of the comfortable kind. By the fifth week she had told him things that were true. Not the dangerous things, not the things about Holt and the stolen letter and the warrant, but other true things, about her mother, about Missouri, about the years of learning to be competent at everything because competence was the only real security she had ever had access to. He had listened with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, and he had told her things in return. He had been married. His wife, Marion, had died of childbed fever 7 years ago, taking the infant with her. He said it without drama, but with a kind of stripped, permanent sorrow that told her it had rearranged everything. He had thrown himself into the ranch afterward with the particular ferocity of a man who has nothing else to offer his grief except labor. "That is when I really learned the land," he said. "Before that I farmed it well enough. After that I needed it." Delia had understood this exactly. She had her own version of needing something outside herself to anchor to. She had begun to care about him somewhere in that fifth week. To care in the specific, clear way that meant she was in serious trouble. She had also noticed in that same week that the weekly supply rider from Abilene had brought a newspaper that included, buried in the Telegraph news column, a brief item about a Kansas City businessman named Holt who was pressing federal authorities regarding a case of employee fraud. The item was small and nonspecific, but it was there. She had removed that page from the newspaper before leaving it on the parlor table for Elijah to read, which was something she was not proud of. And so by the evening of that Tuesday in August, when Elijah Carver had walked out to the fence line as she was checking on the state of the vegetable garden she had planted in the old kitchen plot, and had stood beside her looking out at the eastern field, and had finally said the words that cracked everything open, Delia Pritchard was carrying secrets like a woman carries a full water bucket. Very carefully, very tensely, knowing that any sudden movement would spill everything. She lay awake that night on the narrow bed in the housekeeper's room off the kitchen, listening to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds, and she thought about what it had meant, him saying that. 20 years of planting that field and never caring like now. He was not talking about the field. She knew it with absolute certainty. She knew it the way you know when a storm is coming before the clouds appear, something in the pressure of the air, something in the way the light changes. He was talking about himself, about his life, about the slow, patient labor of a man who had done the work faithfully and well for 2 decades, building this ranch, surviving Marion's death, keeping everything running and solvent and decent, and who had never expected to feel anything beyond a determined, settled acceptance of his own life. And now he felt something more. She had arrived 6 weeks ago and made him feel something more. She pressed her hands over her face in the dark and breathed. She could not tell him about Holt. She could not put him in the middle of her hidden motive and her dark past. He was a good man, an honest man. The kind of man who had deep, uncomplicated roots in one place, who had built something real over 20 years of unrelenting effort, and who deserved better than to be dragged into a legal and moral tangle that had nothing to do with him. But she could not lie to him any more either. She was tired of the weight of it, and more than that, she had the sharp, urgent feeling that time was running out. Holt was looking. The inquiry at the post office had been 3 weeks ago. Each week the telegraph lines carried more traffic, and the territory contracted slightly around her hiding place. She had to decide something. She had to do something. She fell asleep around 3 in the morning and woke at 5 when the roosters started, and she went to the kitchen and built the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the window watching the sky go from black to charcoal to a thin metallic blue, and she made a decision. She would tell him. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough so that she was not living a lie in front of a man she was falling in love with. Enough so that if Holt's people arrived in Redemption Creek, Elijah would not be blindsided. But before she could execute this decision, something else happened. The something else arrived at noon in the form of a man named Trace Alderman, who rode up to the ranch house on a horse that had been pushed hard and who introduced himself to Delia, who answered the door, as a friend of Mr. Carver's from his time in the cattle drives, passing through the territory. He was perhaps 30, lean and pleasant-faced, and he had the kind of easy smile that Delia had learned to treat as a warning signal. She took him in with a glance the way you take in weather. Nice enough. Too relaxed. Eyes that moved too efficiently across the front room when she showed him in. Elijah came in from the east pasture within the hour, and the reunion between the two men had the surface warmth of old acquaintance, but Delia, watching from the kitchen doorway, caught something underneath it that she could not name precisely. A wariness in Elijah that he concealed well but not completely. A too smooth social ease in Alderman that was its own kind of mask. She served dinner and listened without appearing to. And she learned that Trace Alderman had come from Kansas City 3 weeks ago and was heading south to the border. He mentioned Kansas City the way you mention something casually when you are actually watching very carefully for a reaction. The back of Delia's neck went cold. She kept her face absolutely neutral. She refilled the coffee and took the bread off the stove and moved through the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has practiced composure under pressure. Inside, her mind was moving fast. He might be coincidence. People came through ranch country all the time, old connections drifting through on their own business. Or he might be Holt's man, not a marshal, nothing official, because Holt would prefer something quieter and more deniable. An old contact of Elijah's would be exactly the kind of cover a careful man would construct. After dinner, while Alderman sat in the parlor with Elijah and a glass of whiskey, Delia went out the back door and walked to the barn on the pretense of checking the chickens, and she stood in the dimness of the barn and thought very hard. If she ran tonight, she confirmed everything. If Alderman was Holt's man, running told him exactly where to report. If she stayed and Alderman was Holt's man, she was probably already caught. Her third option was the one she hadn't wanted, the one she had been avoiding for weeks. She could tell Elijah the truth and trust him to help her or at the very least to understand. She could stop carrying this alone. She stood in the barn for about 10 minutes. The horses were calm and warm around her. One of them, the big roan that Elijah called Bishop, pressed his nose against her shoulder with the unceremonious affection of an animal that had decided she was acceptable. "All right," she said to him quietly. "All right." She went back inside. Alderman stayed the night in the guest room, as was the custom of the territory where you did not turn a traveler out into the dark, and in the morning he lingered over breakfast with the unhurried quality of a man who is waiting for something. Delia watched him watch her across the table and decided she had been right about him. Elijah went out early to check the north pasture where 2 steers had been reported limping, and Delia found herself alone with Alderman over the breakfast clearing. He helped her stack the dishes, which was unusual, and while he did, he said in a conversational tone, looking at the dishes rather than her, "You know, I was in Kansas City not long ago. Interesting place, big mercantile district, spoke to some people there in the course of my business." Delia continued wiping the table with steady, even strokes. "Is that so?" she said. "Man named Holt," Alderman said. "Gerald Holt, you ever heard that name?" She set down the cloth and looked at him directly because looking away would be the wrong move and she had enough nerve left to make the right one. "No," she said. His face shifted. "Not much. Just enough to tell her they were done pretending." "Miss Pritchard," he said, and now his voice had dropped its easy warmth and was simply level and pragmatic. "I am not a lawman. I want to be plain about that. I am a finder of persons on a private contract. Mr. Holt has a considerable sum riding on the resolution of a legal matter that involves your name, and my job is to locate you and send word of your whereabouts so that the appropriate legal mechanisms can be initiated. I mean you no physical harm. I am simply here to confirm what I already suspect." Delia looked at him for a long moment. "And if I told you that your suspicion was incorrect and I have never been to Kansas City in my life, I would tell you," he said pleasantly, "that I have a very specific description from 3 separate sources and that you match it near exactly." The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. "How much is he paying you?" she said. Alderman tilted his head. "That is not a negotiation I am authorized to engage in." "I am not negotiating," she said. "I am asking a question out of pure curiosity about what my freedom is worth to a businessman in Kansas City." Something moved across his face that might have been reluctant amusement. "Enough," he said. She nodded. She picked up the cloth again and finished wiping the table, and she said, "I would appreciate it if you did not send any wire today. Miss Pritchard, I am going to speak to Mr. Carver," she said quietly. "He has a right to know what is happening on his property before outside parties start making decisions about it. You said you are not a lawman. Then you have no legal obligation to act today rather than tomorrow. Give me until this evening." There was a long pause. Alderman looked at her with the calculating eyes of a man weighing risk against some more ambiguous consideration. Then he said, "This evening." She walked out of the kitchen. She found Elijah at the north pasture fence, crouched beside one of the limping steers while Pete Granger held it still, and she waited at the edge of the field with her hands folded and her heart working harder than usual. And when Elijah stood and saw her face, he said something quiet to Pete and crossed to her. He read her expression the way he read weather. "What happened?" he said. It was not a question. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Several things, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything because some of it is not flattering to me and I would like to get it all out before I lose my nerve." Something shifted in his face. Not alarm exactly. More like the particular bracing quality of a man who has already been carrying a suspicion and is now being confirmed. "Walk with me," he said. They walked away from the pasture, away from Pete and the steers, out toward the eastern fence line, the same fence where the evening before he had told her about the field and never caring like now. She noted this without saying anything. She told him everything, not quickly. She was precise about it, because precision was how she managed things that frightened her, and this frightened her more than anything had in a long time. She told him about Holt, about the books, about the warrant and the false accusation. She told him about Clara Whitfield on the train and the letter, and how she had used it not as deception exactly but as access, a way in through a door that was already standing open. She told him about the inquiry at the post office 3 weeks ago that she had not reported to him. She told him about the newspaper page she had removed. She told him about Trace Alderman's conversation in the kitchen that morning. She stood at the fence and told him all of it, and when she was done she looked at him directly and waited. He stood with his hands resting on the top rail of the fence, looking out at the field, and the silence stretched long enough that she had time to prepare herself for multiple outcomes, none of them particularly comfortable. Then he said, You kept the accounts straight, she blinked. Yes. Never a penny off in 6 weeks, he said. I checked, not because I doubted you, because I check everything. Yes, she said. And the cooking, he said. And the house. He turned and looked at her. You came here under unusual circumstances, but you have worked honestly for every day of your wages, and you told me the truth when it mattered. I should have told you sooner, she said. Yes, he agreed without heat. You should have. He was quiet for a moment. This man, Alderman, he is still at the house. He is. Elijah nodded slowly. He turned back to the field. He was thinking, she could see it, working through the problem with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. Holt's accusation, he said. The embezzlement claim. Is there any documentation on your side? Anything that could disprove it? This was the thing she had been turning over for months. The original ledger books would show it, she said. Holt was using 2 sets of books. I kept the real ones for 3 years. I know what is in them, and I know where the discrepancies are, and I know which entries are false. But those ledgers are in Holt's possession in Kansas City, and any testimony I give would be my word against a wealthy man's. Not necessarily, Elijah said. She looked at him. What do you mean? I know a man, he said. Cattle buyer I have worked with for 6 years. He handles accounts for half a dozen major operations between here and Kansas City, and he has had his own difficulties with Holt on a business matter 2 years back. He has documentation of his own that he has been sitting on because he had no corroboration. Between his records and your testimony, he stopped. She was looking at him with an expression she could not fully control. You knew about Holt, she said. Elijah turned to face her fully. I knew of him, he said carefully. He is known in the cattle trade as a man who finds ways to arrange things to his advantage. My contact in Abilene mentioned his name about a year ago in connection with a dispute that cost 3 smaller operations significant money. I had no direct dealings with him. Why didn't you say anything, she asked, when Alderman mentioned his name at dinner? Because I wanted to see what you would do, Elijah said, and his voice was even but his eyes were not. I have known for several days that Alderman's reason for coming here was not purely social. He sent me a letter 2 weeks ago asking if he might stop in. The letter was friendly, but it was also probing, asking about the ranch, about my domestic arrangements, about who was currently in my employ. He paused. I am not a man who misses those kinds of signals. Delia stared at him. The trap she had thought she was in had different walls than she had imagined. You knew he was looking for me, she said. I suspected he was looking for someone, Elijah said. And when you arrived 6 weeks ago under circumstances that were slightly unusual, a replacement for a woman I had never met, appearing with very short notice, I noted it. And yet you hired me, she said, and kept me. I did, he said. Why? His jaw tightened just slightly. He looked away toward the field again, and then back at her with the directness of a man who has decided to stop going around the edge of something and simply say it. Because you were good at the work, he said. Because you were honest in every practical matter even when you were hiding something. Because, he stopped, looked at the fence rail. Because of what I told you last evening, which you ran from. There it was, the thing they were actually standing at the fence to address. I did not run, she said. You walked very quickly, he said. She felt the pull of wanting to smile at that, and she held it back because this was not a moment for smiling. Elijah, she said, I am a woman with a warrant outstanding against her name and a private finder in your guest room. I am not in a position to, I am not asking you to be in any position, he said. I told you a thing yesterday because it was true, and because I have learned in my life that when something true is pressing to be said, it is better to say it, regardless of what happens after. He met her eyes. I am not asking you for anything. I am simply telling you that I have planted this field 20 years and never cared like now, and that I wanted you to know that. The silence was different this time. Not the silence of unresolved things, but of things that have been resolved but have not yet been answered. Delia looked at him, at this weathered, patient, careful man who had been quietly watching over her without her knowledge, who had been building a case for her defense before she even knew she needed one, and she said, I care too. That is the problem, I care too. He looked at her for a long moment. Then we will deal with the problem, he said simply. Together. The word together landed somewhere in her chest with the weight and warmth of something she had not felt in a very long time. They walked back to the house. Alderman was on the porch, whittling with a small knife, and he looked up when they approached with the careful expression of a man assessing whether the variables had shifted. Elijah stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at him steadily. I understand your purpose here, he said. And I want to tell you that I intend to ride to Abilene tomorrow morning, with Miss Pritchard to consult with a legal man I know. Whatever Gerald Holt has initiated can be answered through proper channels. I would ask you, as a courtesy between men who have known each other a number of years, to give us the time to do that before you wire anyone. Alderman studied him. Then he studied Delia. Then he folded his penknife and put it in his pocket and said, I will give you 3 days, Elijah. 3 days is what I can do. That is enough, Elijah said. They left before sunup the next morning, Elijah on his horse and Delia on the lighter mare, riding north toward Abilene with the sky still dark overhead and the stars beginning to fade. It was a hard 6-hour ride, and Elijah set a pace that was steady and efficient, and they did not talk much for the first 2 hours because there was no need to, and because the land demanded a kind of attention when you were moving through it in the early dark that made talk feel beside the point. Around the second hour, when the sky had come up into a deep blue and the day was still cool enough to be merciful, Delia said, Tell me about the cattle buyer, the one in Abilene. His name is Samuel Oates, Elijah said. He is a careful man and an honest one, and he has more cause to want Holt exposed than most. 2 years ago, Holt arranged for a shipment of Oates cattle to be held up in a legal dispute over brand registration, a fraudulent dispute contrived specifically to force Oates to sell at a loss on a compressed timeline. Oates lost approximately $1,200 in 6 months of negotiating position. And he kept documentation, Delia said. He is that kind of man, Elijah said. The kind who keeps everything. Like you, she said. He glanced at her. I suppose so. They rode in silence for a little while, and then Delia said, What made you keep documentation on Alderman's letter? Did you actually suspect him from the start? I suspect most things from the start and verify as I go, Elijah said, not with self-congratulation but simply as a statement of method. When a man I have not heard from in 4 years writes a friendly letter in which he carefully ascertains the domestic arrangements of my household, I keep the letter and I think about it. You are a very methodical person, she said. The land teaches you that, he said. Nothing on a ranch works if you are not paying attention. The sun had come up fully by the time they reached the first flat open stretches north of Redemption Creek, and in the morning light Delia looked at Elijah riding beside her and thought about 20 years of planting a field alone, and felt a grief for him so specific and personal that it surprised her. He had been here all this time, working and grieving and enduring, and the land had been his only language for love for years. She thought about Marion. She did not ask about her, not today, not on this ride, but she thought about her. For what it is worth, she said, Clara Whitfield seemed like a good woman. I think she would have served you well. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you have served me well too. It was not a romantic declaration. It was just a fact, stated in his plain way, and for some reason it meant more to her than any elaborate speech could have. Abilene in August was loud and hot and thick, with the business of a town that served the end of the cattle trails, and Samuel Oates had an office above the feed and grain on the main street that smelled of leather and sawdust and old paper. He was a compact, red-faced man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and the clipped speech of someone who had been doing business with difficult people for a long time and had streamlined his communication accordingly. He shook Elijah's hand. He looked at Delia with sharp assessment that was not unfriendly. He listened. Delia told him the full account, more organized and detailed here than she had been at the fence, because she had spent the 6-hour ride marshaling her facts in order. She told him everything she knew about Holt's books, including specific figures and dates that she had committed to memory with the same precision she brought to everything. She named the false entries. She described the two-ledger system. She described the moment when she had confronted Holt privately about the discrepancies, and he had told her with his quiet smile that she had made a mistake and that the books as he had written them were correct. Oates listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and laced his fingers across his chest. "The Q Street transaction in March of last year," he said. Delia blinked. "Yes, the third week of March. There was a payment listed as supplies expenses against the Morrison account that should have been listed as personal disbursement against Holt's own account," Oates said. "I know it. I was the Morrison account. He charged my transaction on both sides. Collected from me and charged the cost to himself as a business expense, then pocketed the differential. My documentation shows the payment I made. His ledger would show the supply expense against my account. Between the two, he sat forward. Between the two, a competent territorial attorney could make a very uncomfortable case for Mr. Holt." "Can you recommend one?" Elijah said. Oates smiled briefly, the smile of a man who has been waiting for this specific conversation for approximately 2 years. "I can do better than that," he said. "I have had one retained on contingency since 18 months ago, because I knew eventually this moment would come." The next 2 days moved with the compressed, purposeful energy of things finally in motion after too long of being still. The attorney, a careful and meticulous man named Whitmore, took Delia's sworn statement that first afternoon and Oates' documentation the following morning, and he told them both with measured confidence that while the legal process would take time, the combination of evidence was substantial enough to shift the burden of proof significantly in Delia's favor. "The warrant against you," he told Delia in his precise lawyer's voice, "was issued on Holt's complaint alone. It is not a federal warrant. It is a territorial one, and territorial warrants can be challenged on the basis of new evidence. What you have given me today constitutes new evidence. What Mr. Oates has given me constitutes corroboration. I will file a challenge within the week and request a stay on the warrant. It will take several months to resolve completely, but I can give you written documentation of the challenge filing that will protect you from summary action in the interim." Several months felt enormous. It also felt survivable. She walked out of Whitmore's office into the Abilene afternoon with a lightness in her limbs that she had not felt since Kansas City, and Elijah was waiting outside on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand, watching her face as she came through the door. "He can challenge the warrant," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Good." They rode back to Redemption Creek in the late afternoon light, and this time there was more talking. She told him about her mother, who had died of influenza when Delia was 19 and left her properly alone in the world. He told her about learning the ranch from his father, a hard but not unkind man who had taught Elijah everything he knew about cattle and land management and almost nothing about anything else. He told her about Marion, the real Marion, not just the fact of her death. She had been funny. That was the thing he said first, which surprised Delia. She laughed at things most people didn't notice, he said. Small things. She found the world genuinely funny, and she was never cruel about it. He was quiet for a moment. "I have missed her laughter more than anything else." Delia listened to this with the particular care it deserved. She did not try to comfort him, because comfort was not what was being sought. He was simply sharing something real, and she received it as such. "She would have been good at this ranch," Delia said. "She was," he said, "in the time she had." When they arrived back at the ranch as the sky went dark, Trace Alderman was still on the premises, and Elijah explained the situation to him with the same plain directness he used for everything. The legal challenge had been filed. There was documentation. Going after Delia Pritchard now would mean going after a formally contested matter that was before a territorial legal authority, which made Holt's warrant significantly thinner as a justification. Alderman listened. He thought about it. He was, as Delia had suspected, the kind of man whose loyalty to his contract had limits when those limits were defined by legal exposure and practicality. "I will tell Holt what you have told me," he said. "What he does with it is his affair." "That is all we are asking," Elijah said. Alderman left the next morning. Delia watched him ride out from the kitchen window, and when he disappeared over the ridge, she pressed her hands flat on the kitchen counter and took 3 slow, deliberate breaths. The immediate crisis was not over. Holt could pursue other avenues. The warrant challenge would take months. She was not free yet, not in any complete sense. But she was safer than she had been a week ago, and she was no longer alone in being unsafe. That afternoon, the work of the ranch reasserted itself in the way it always did, with the absolute indifference of animals and weather and soil to human emotional events. There was a fence to mend in the south pasture. There were accounts to reconcile. There was bread to bake and supper to make and laundry to hang. And Delia moved through all of it with the particular sense of a woman who has set down something heavy and is relearning how her body feels without it. Elijah came in at evening and ate the supper she set out and drank his coffee and sat at the kitchen table after, and she sat across from him instead of cleaning up, which was a change from their established pattern. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for not telling you sooner, for removing that newspaper page, for letting this continue without full disclosure." He looked at her steadily. "I accept it," he said. "And I want you to know that my feelings toward you are not contingent on your having arrived here without complications. People arrive places with complications. I am not a naive man." "No," she said, "you are not. But I want to ask you something," he said. "Yes, what you said at the fence yesterday, that you care too." He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. "What does that mean to you? Because I am a man who says what he means, and I want to be sure I understand what you mean." Delia looked at him across the table in the low lamplight. The kitchen smelled of bread and coffee, and the clean dirt smell of late summer that came through the window screens. And the clock on the mantelpiece ticked its steady, indifferent tick. And she thought about Clara Whitfield on the train and the letter and the $11, and the long, improbable chain of events that had placed her in this kitchen, in this chair, across from this man. "It means," she said carefully, "that over 6 weeks I have come to know you as someone I deeply respect, and that respecting you turned into something more, which I did not plan for and in fact actively discouraged in myself, because I was not in a position to." She stopped. "I am not accustomed to depending on anyone," she said. "I have managed my own affairs since I was 19, and I have been wrong about people in important ways, and it made me cautious." "That is sensible," he said. "It is," she agreed, "but I think I may have overcorrected into a kind of isolation, a kind of determined self-sufficiency that becomes its own trap." She looked at him. "You are not a trap. You are the opposite of a trap." Something moved through his expression, slow and deep, like a current under still water. "Delia," he said. "I care," she said, simply. "I care about you in a way that has nothing to do with this ranch or my situation or the legal difficulties or anything practical at all. I care about you because you are who you are, and I would care about you if I met you in a Kansas City street with no complications and no history." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the warmth of his palm was the warmth of a man who had been working outside all his life, and she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest. "Then we proceed," he said, "carefully, given the circumstances, but we proceed." "Yes," she said. That was, in its essential nature, the beginning of something openly acknowledged between them, and the knowledge of it changed the quality of the days that followed in a way that was quiet but unmistakable. September arrived, and the heat broke slightly, and the ranch shifted into the preparations for fall with the constant activity that characterized all seasonal transitions. Delia worked, and so did Elijah, and they were rarely in each other's company in the middle of the day. But in the evenings they had their coffee and their talk, and sometimes on a Sunday afternoon when the immediate work was done, they walked the property together. along the fence lines and through the fields and down to the creek, and he showed her the land the way you show someone something you love. She learned the names of things. The names he had given to particular sections of the range, not official names, just practical ones that had accumulated over 20 years of daily use. The north pasture was just the north pasture, but the field by the creek bend he called the low ground because it collected water and grew fat grass, and the rocky eastern ridge beyond the field he called the lookout because from the top of it you could see for 10 miles in 3 directions. "Come up here," he said one Sunday in September, holding a hand out to her on the loose shale of the ridge path. She took his hand and he pulled her up the last steep section, and she stood beside him at the top and looked out at 10 miles of Texas in every direction, the creek winding its silver thread through the valley, the ranch building small and solid in the middle distance, the cattle moving like slow brown clouds across the pasture, the sky enormous and blue and going on forever. "You have been looking at this for 20 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "Does it stay beautiful?" "It gets more so," he said. She stood there with his hand still in hers and looked at his land, and she understood fully and without qualification what it cost a man like Elijah to say the things he had said to her at the fence, to break 20 years of careful containment and say, "I have never cared like now." The land was his evidence. The land was his love letter. The land was everything he knew how to say when he could not say the direct thing. She understood it, and it undid her completely. She turned and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and the distance between them on that rocky ridge was about 14 inches and decreasing in a way that felt entirely inevitable. And when he kissed her, it was with the same quality as everything else he did, direct and considered and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, and also as if time was precisely the thing he was no longer willing to waste. She had been kissed before. This was different. This was the kiss of a man who meant it completely. Afterward they stood at the top of the lookout ridge and watched the sun shift, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. October brought 2 significant developments. The first was the letter from Whitmore, the attorney in Abilene, informing Delia that the territorial challenge to the warrant had been formally entered, and that the Kansas City authorities had been notified of the evidentiary dispute. Pending a hearing scheduled for January, the warrant was effectively in suspension. Whitmore's language was precise and cautious, as lawyer language always was, but the underlying message was clear. Gerald Holt was no longer able to pursue a simple enforcement action. He would have to make his case before a legal authority with full evidence on both sides. The second development was a letter from Holt himself, which arrived through an intermediary address she had thought was private, and therefore informed her that Holt's reach was longer than she had hoped. The letter was short. He told her that he did not intend to pursue the legal matter further, provided she signed a quiet agreement not to testify against him or cooperate with any regulatory inquiry into his business practices. He made the offer in businesslike terms, with no overt threat, but the implicit threat was woven through every sentence like wire through a fence post. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that letter, and then she brought it to Elijah. He read it. His expression did not change while he read, which was how she knew he was angry. "He is frightened," Elijah said, setting the letter down. "Yes," she said. "A frightened man with resources is dangerous," he said. "But a frightened man making written offers of quiet agreements has already started losing." He looked at her. "Send this to Whitmore immediately. If Holt is making informal settlement overtures, it means he does not want this before a legal authority." "I know," she said. I needed a moment before acting." He looked at her. Then he said, "Take the moment." She sent the letter to Whitmore the next morning. Whitmore's response came a week later, and it was, professionally speaking, the equivalent of a man rubbing his hands together with focused satisfaction. The unsolicited contact from Holt constituted, in Whitmore's estimation, strong indication that the evidentiary position against him was solid enough to make him willing to negotiate rather than contest. Whitmore was now in communication with a colleague in Kansas City who had been independently building a case against Holt for 3 years on behalf of several other clients. "It appears," Whitmore wrote in his spare, careful prose, "that Mr. Holt has been a busy man, and that his business has caught up with him." The case moved forward through the winter months with the grinding pace of legal processes everywhere, and Delia lived inside the daily life of the ranch and did not think about it every moment. She thought about it regularly, soberly, with the focused calm of someone who has done what they can do and must now wait. But she did not let it consume the days. The days had Elijah in them, and the days were good. They were careful about the development of their relationship, was not quite the right word for something that was in many ways still forming. They were deliberate about it. Elijah was by nature a man who did not rush things that mattered, and Delia was by nature a woman who needed to trust before she could fully let herself be trusted with. They talked every evening. They walked on Sundays. They kissed on the ridge and sometimes in the kitchen doorway, and once, memorably, in the middle of a rainstorm when they were caught together in the south pasture, checking a fence, and they ran for the barn, and stood in the dry dimness laughing at each other's soaked condition. And he pulled her toward him and kissed her with rain still dripping from his hat brim onto her shoulder. And she put her hands on the front of his wet shirt and kissed him back with everything she had. "You are going to get me thoroughly drenched," she told him. "You are already thoroughly drenched," he pointed out. "I mean emotionally," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then that rare, full smile came across his face, the one she had seen perhaps half a dozen times, and that was worth waiting for every time. "Good," he said. "Fair's fair." November. The legal case in Kansas City had gathered sufficient weight that the territorial authority referred it to a federal commercial review board, which was, Whitmore explained, both a complication and a significant escalation in the right direction. Federal review meant federal jurisdiction, which meant Holt's local connections and judge friends were considerably less useful to him than they had been. He dropped the personal warrant against Delia entirely in November, which Whitmore informed her of by telegram. "Holt withdraws complaint. Stop warrant vacated. Stop congratulations. Stop." She read the telegram in the middle of the general store with Dorsey the postmaster watching her curiously, and she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and walked out into the November street with the cold, clear air of a Texas morning in late autumn, and she stood there for about 30 seconds feeling something she hadn't felt in nearly a year. Safe. She felt safe. She rode back to the ranch and found Elijah at the water trough beside the barn, working with Pete on a pump that had been giving trouble, and she waited until he looked up and saw her face, and whatever he read there made him hand Pete the wrench and walk toward her. She gave him the telegram. He read it, folded it with the same care she had used, handed it back. "Good," he said. And then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided the time has come, he said, "Walk with me." They walked to the eastern fence. Of course they did. It was their place by now, the place where things of weight were said. The field behind the fence in November was brown and still, stripped of its summer growth, and the sky was that particular pale winter blue that made the world look clean and slightly unreal. The creek was audible in the distance. Elijah stood at the fence with his arms resting on the top rail and looked out at the field for a while. She stood beside him and waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you answer, it will not change the work situation here or make things uncomfortable. I have no interest in pressuring you." "I know that," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. The words were simple and direct and very Elijah, and they landed exactly as he had intended them to, with the full weight of a serious, unhurried, fully considered declaration. Delia looked at the field. The same field he had told her about at this same fence on a hot August evening that had started everything. She thought about 20 years of planting. She thought about the way he had kissed her in the rain. She thought about the Sunday afternoons on the lookout ridge with his hand in hers and the world spread out below them. She thought about Clara Whitfield on the train and the letter and the improbable chain of necessity and chance that had brought her here. "The field," she said. "Yes," he said. "You said it remembers what it is capable of," she said, "that the soil remembers." "Yes," he said. "I think I had forgotten what I was capable of," she said. "Not competence, not survival, those I remembered, but the other kind of capable, the kind that involves trusting someone." He turned and looked at her. "I have not forgotten it any more," she said, "in case you wanted to know the effect you have had." "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." They stood at the fence in the cold November air for a while after that, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the field, and the silence was the good kind. The wedding was in December, which in Redemption Creek meant a small ceremony at the church with the preacher and the ranch hands, and a handful of townspeople who had come to know Delia over her months in town. Elijah's sister, Margaret, came south with her husband James and their 3 children, and she embraced Delia with the unambiguous warmth of a woman who had been worried about her brother for 7 years and was quietly, deeply relieved. Delia wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she ordered from the Abilene Dry Goods, a deep blue wool that was appropriate for December, and that she thought made her look like someone who knew where she was going. Elijah wore his best clothes and stood at the front of the church with the straight, serious posture of a man performing the most important piece of work he had ever undertaken. And when she walked up the aisle toward him, he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she nearly stopped walking for a moment. The preacher read the vows and they repeated them, and when Elijah said, "I will," in his plain, certain voice the word had no decoration or performance to it, just the simple bedrock quality of a man making an honest commitment, and Delia heard it as exactly what it was. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, husband and wife, under a December sky that was threatening snow and didn't quite manage it, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench and his arm was around her shoulders against the cold, and she thought, "This is mine." Not the ranch specifically, not the legality of the thing, but this person beside me, this warmth, this plain and unhurried and completely reliable love. "This is mine and I am his." "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That you drive this wagon the same way you do everything," she said. "How is that?" "Steadily," she said, "without showing off." He gave her the sideways look she had come to love. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It is my favorite thing about you." He kissed the top of her head, which was not a dramatic gesture but was exactly right. That night, with the ranch quiet and the winter cold held back by the solid walls his father had built, she lay in the dark and listened to him breathe beside her and felt the strangeness and rightness of it simultaneously. This life, this bed, this man, and thought about Clara Whitfield one more time with sincere and specific gratitude. She hoped Clara Whitfield was at peace somewhere. She hoped she would have approved. Winter deepened. The legal proceedings in Kansas City ground forward without her active participation required, and by February of 1880, the Federal Commercial Review Board had determined that Gerald Holt had engaged in systematic fraudulent accounting practices across multiple client relationships. He was fined a significant sum and barred from commercial practice in 3 territories. He did not go to prison. Men of his connections rarely did, and Delia had accepted this reality early, but his operation was effectively dismantled, his reputation destroyed, and his reach into the territory gone. Whitmore sent a final letter in late February summarizing the outcome. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning light and then set it on the table and went outside and stood in the cold February air and breathed it for a while. Elijah came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her standing there. "Letter," he said. "It's done," she said. He came and stood beside her. She handed him the letter and he read it and handed it back. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I can exhale completely," she said. "For the first time in about a year." "Then exhale," he said. She did, slowly, completely, all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. Spring came to the Carver ranch with the specific extravagance it always had in that part of Texas, sudden and green and full of the constant noise of new life. The cows calved. The winter wheat came up. The creek rose with the rains, and the low ground by the bend went lush and fat with grass. The chickens started laying in proper numbers again. And in the eastern field, for the first time in 20 years, Elijah Carver planted something other than cattle grass. He did it on a Saturday morning in April, starting before dawn with the small seed spreader his father had built, working the east field in careful rows while the sky went from black to gray to gold. Delia came out at sunup with coffee and stood at the fence watching him work, and when he came in at the end of the row she handed him the cup. "What did you plant?" she said. "Sorghum," he said. "Same as my father. I want to see what it does." She looked at the turned earth, dark and furrowed and full of some quality she now understood better than she had when he first described it. Something like potential, something like memory. "It will be something beautiful," she said. He looked at her over the coffee cup with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was not quite a smile but carried all the warmth of one. "Yes," he agreed, "it will." She was pregnant by May, a fact she confirmed with the help of the doctor's wife in town, who was the woman you went to for such consultations, and who confirmed it with brisk, friendly professionalism. Delia sat with this information for a day before telling Elijah, not from any doubt but from the particular private pleasure of holding something wonderful to yourself for a moment before sharing it. She told him at the fence, the eastern fence. It was becoming the location of all the things that mattered. He was quiet for a long moment after she said it. She watched his face go through something complex, not just happiness, though happiness was part of it, but also the particular quality of a man for whom this subject carried the dark weight of what it had cost before, and who was now being asked to carry it again with a different outcome. "Marion," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. His voice was level, but his hands on the fence rail were tight. "I am healthy," she said, "and I am not afraid. And we are not in a remote homestead with no doctor closer than a day's ride. Dr. Beaumont is 6 miles. He looked at her. His eyes were the deep, still water color. "I know," he said. "I know all that." He exhaled. "I am." He stopped. "Terrified," she supplied. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I. We can be terrified together and it will still come out all right." He reached out and put his hand over hers on the fence rail. She turned her hand over and gripped his. They stood like that for a while, looking at the eastern field where the sorghum was coming up in rows, small and green and impossibly determined, reaching up out of the dark soil with the same patient faith that had been going into that ground for 20 years. The pregnancy was straightforward. Delia was healthy and strong, and the doctor's wife checked on her with regular, reassuring efficiency. And as the summer deepened, the ranch adapted around her increasing condition with the practical flexibility that characterized the whole operation. The hands helped more. Elijah came in earlier. He never made a performance of it. He simply rearranged what he rearranged and did not comment on it, in the manner of a man who has learned that the most effective kind of care is the kind that doesn't announce itself. He would sit beside her on the porch in the evenings in the thick July heat, his chair angled toward hers, and they would talk or not talk, and sometimes he would put a hand against her belly with the unaffected wonder of a man encountering something that exceeds his capacity for measured response, and she would watch his face in the last light of the day, and think, every time, about the fence and the field and 20 years and never caring like now. Their son was born in November 1884. A Tuesday, because Tuesdays had become, apparently, the days on which significant things happened in the Carver household. The labor was hard but not extraordinary, attended by the doctor and his wife both, with Elijah present in the way that was not yet common but that Delia had simply stated she required, and he stayed steady and present and slightly gray in the face for the last 2 hours, and when the baby arrived, healthy and loud and taking his place in the world with considerable vocal commitment, Elijah stood and held the boy and said nothing for about 2 full minutes. Then he said, "Thomas." "Thomas," Delia agreed. His voice when he said it was rough in a way it rarely was, and she knew the weight it carried, not just the present joy but the long shadow of grief it walked beside, and she loved him more in that moment than she had thought possible. Thomas Carver was, from the first days, a serious and observant child. He watched the world with the same quality of attention his father brought to everything, taking it in and processing it before committing to a response. He also had his mother's precision, the careful way she named things, the accuracy she brought to observation. The sorghum harvest in October had been significant enough to warrant a second planting in the spring, and Elijah had hired on an additional hand for the eastern field, a young man from East Texas named Cornelius who was cheerful and hardworking, and who had taken to Pete Granger like a younger brother. The ranch was expanding in a measured, intentional way, not overreaching, never overreaching, just a careful addition here and there as the resources allowed. Margaret and James came south for Thomas's first Christmas and stayed for 2 weeks, and the house was full of noise and children, and the particular warm chaos of family that Delia had not had since she was 9 years old and her father died. She stood in the middle of it one evening and watched Elijah sitting on the floor with Thomas on his knee, and his nephew climbing his back and Margaret laughing at something James had said, and she felt the fullness of it so acutely that she had to go into the kitchen for a moment just to hold it privately. Margaret followed her. "He was so closed after Marion," Margaret said, without preamble. "For years. You could love him, but you could not reach him. The ranch was his whole world, and he kept it that way on purpose." "I know," Delia said. "You reached him," Margaret said. "However you managed that, and I think you managed it by simply being yourself, which is the only method that works on someone like Elijah. You reached him." She looked at Delia with the direct, clear gaze of a woman who says what she means. "I am glad you came, Delia, truly glad." "So am I," Delia said, and meant it down to the bone. 1885 unfolded with the unhurried richness of a life that has found its right shape. The legal matters were entirely concluded, the final paperwork filed and settled, the last thread of the Holt affair closed and done with. Delia received one last document from Whitmore acknowledging the complete resolution of all outstanding claims, and she put it in the strongbox where the ranch's important documents were kept, and that was the end of that particular chapter of her life. She had written to Clara Whitfield's family, a niece in Missouri, to express her sympathies and to mention, carefully, that she had encountered Clara briefly on a train and that the woman had seemed kind and full of life. The letter was an inadequate gesture toward something she owed, but it was what she could do, and she did it. Thomas walked at 11 months, which was something the doctor's wife called early, and which Elijah watched with the expression of a man both unsurprised and entirely undone. He walked with the deliberate, wide-legged determination of someone who has thought about this problem, and arrived at a solution, and is now implementing it. And when he made it from the kitchen table to Delia's waiting arms across the room, he turned and looked at his father with an expression of composed satisfaction that made Elijah laugh. A full, unguarded laugh that Delia filed carefully in the place where she kept the things she never wanted to forget. By 1886, Thomas had a little brother named William, who arrived in March with considerably more drama than Thomas had, and who announced his presence in the world with a volume and insistence that suggested he would be a very different person from his reserved older brother. He was. William was loud and physical and given to enthusiasm, and he and Thomas balanced each other with the instinctive complementarity of siblings who have divided the available territory of personality between them. The ranch had 360 head of cattle now. The eastern field produced a sorghum crop that had gained a modest reputation in the local market. Delia had taken over the full accounting of the operation, which she managed with the precision she had always brought to numbers, and Elijah trusted her with it the way he trusted the sky to tell him about weather completely and without reservation. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, which in Texas was most of the year, And the boys played in the yard, and the sun went down behind the western ridge, and the creek made its quiet sound in the distance, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and the whole ranch breathed around them with the deep, living rhythm of a place that is being well tended and deeply loved. One evening in the September of 1886, Delia was sitting on the porch watching the last light on the field when Elijah came and sat beside her. The boys were inside with Pete, who had become as much a fixture of the household as the kitchen stove, reading Thomas something from one of the books Delia had ordered from the bookseller in Abilene. "Walk to the fence," Elijah said. She looked at him. "What are you going to tell me at the fence this time?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "I just want to stand at the fence with you." They walked out in the last of the evening light, and the field behind the fence was golden with the late sorghum that hadn't been harvested yet, tall and heavy, and swaying just slightly in the evening air. He put his arms on the rail and looked out at it, and she stood beside him and did the same. 3 years ago on this same fence he had said a thing that had changed everything. She remembered the exact weight of it, the exact way the crow had called in the cottonwoods and the creek had whispered, and the way the words had landed like a blade between her ribs. She reached out and put her hand over his on the rail. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "Yes. I came here running from something," she said. "I came here surviving. Everything I did in the first weeks was survival. Even caring about you, even the beginning of that, I was trying to stop myself because caring felt like a liability when you are surviving." "I know," he said. "But I am not surviving anymore," she said. "I am not running. I am not hiding or calculating or managing a situation." She turned to look at him. "I am just here, fully. This is you and the boys and this field and this fence. This is my life. Not a temporary shelter from something, but my actual life. And I want you to know that." He turned to look at her. The light was going orange-red in the sky above the ridge, and it lay across his face in a way that showed every line and mark of his years, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I know it," he said, "but I am glad you said it." He lifted her hand from the rail and held it, and they stood at the fence in the last of the September light with the sorghum swaying behind them and the ranch breathing all around them and the distant voices of the boys coming from the house, and everything that had been broken or frightened or hidden or running was still and at rest. "You planted this field 20 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "And now look at it," she said. He looked at the field. He looked at her. His expression was the open, unguarded one she had spent a year learning to read and would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "Yes," he said again. "Now look at it." A third child came in the winter of 1888, a girl this time, the boy's sister, who arrived in January with the calm assurance of someone who has been expected and has taken her time about it. They named her Clara, and Delia did not explain the full weight of that name to anyone but Elijah, who listened and understood and agreed it was the right name. Clara grew up with her father's capacity for stillness and her mother's precision, and her brothers thought she was entirely too composed for a child and were simultaneously helpless before her, as older brothers tend to be. Delia had taken on a small teaching role at the Redemption Creek Schoolhouse by 1889, 2 afternoons a week teaching basic accounting and letters to the older children, because the school teacher, an overworked young man from Missouri, had gratefully accepted the help, and because Delia had discovered in herself a genuine satisfaction in passing on what she knew. Her mother had been a school teacher. It felt, in a way she had not anticipated, like continuity. Elijah had expanded the herd carefully and acquired the adjacent western property when it came up after its owner died without heirs, adding 140 acres of good grazing land to the operation. He managed the expansion with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, adding hands slowly, building infrastructure before cattle, never overreaching. They were not wealthy in any dramatic sense, but they were solid and stable and deeply, practically comfortable, which was the kind of wealth that Delia had grown up without and understood to be the real kind. One spring morning in 1890, Elijah came in from the eastern field with a handful of sorghum grain and set it on the kitchen table in front of Delia, who was going over the quarterly accounts. She looked at it. "Something wrong with the crop," she said. "No," he said. "Something exceptional with it." He sat down across from her. "The yield on the east field this year is going to be the highest since I started planting it. The soil," he stopped, shook his head slightly. "The soil is doing something I have not seen it do in 20 years of working it." "What is it doing?" she said. He looked at the handful of grain on the table. "It is remembering what it is capable of," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window between them and the house around them, full of the sounds of children and ranch and ordinary daily life, and she felt the complete, closed, exact rightness of where she was and who she was with. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is doing." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and gripped it. And outside the window the eastern field was golden in the morning light, and the creek was running clear, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and the whole of it, all 20 years and all the subsequent years and all the years still to come lay there in the light of an ordinary morning, quietly extraordinary. All the dark past was past. All the hidden things had been brought into the light and resolved. All the running was done. There was only this: the fence and the field and the man who had planted it and the woman who had come, against all odds and through all difficulty, to stand beside him. 20 years and never caring like now. And after everything, finally now.